Hello, this is Tom Davis and welcome back to the Davis Family History video series. This video will take us from Lurgan Street in Dublin, Ireland to Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, to Mexico and ultimately to France. John Davis was born in Lurgan Street, Dublin, Ireland on the 26th of March 1890 to his parents John Davis and Agnes Holt. He was their second child, his sister Elizabeth being born some years earlier. Living conditions in Dublin at this time were hard, with people working at low-paid jobs and living in run-down tenement housing. Illness was common and life expectancy was short. Agnes Holt Davis passed away on the 6th of November 1899 at the age of 42 years, when John was only 9 years old. The Irish census of 1901 shows John and his father living with his grandmother, Margaret McGrain Davis, at Moneypenny Yard on East Arran Street in Dublin. John's sister Elizabeth Davis had already emigrated to America in the late 1880s. Margaret McGrain Davis passed away on the 20th of January 1907, and this left John and his father living on their own. John's sister Elizabeth had married John Stocker in Philadelphia in 1894 and had made a good life for herself there. Elizabeth returned home to Ireland in 1907 and brought her brother John back to America with her to start a new life there. John Davis arrived in New York on the 31st of August 1907 and went to live with Elizabeth and her husband on 1st Avenue, Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. John was just 17 years old at the time, but soon got a job at the Phoenix Iron Company in Phoenixville. John joined the 1st Pennsylvania Field Artillery National Guard on the 22nd of June 1916, which was not surprising as the company where John worked for many years was not only a supplier of construction steelwork, but was also the major producer of the 3-inch cannon for the American Army. Clearly, John's experience from the Phoenix Iron Company was very useful in the National Guard, and he quickly was promoted to the rank of Chief Mechanic. Field artillery at this time was horse-drawn, but this was also something that John would have been very familiar with. His grandfather and most of the Davis men in Dublin were carters, and John would have grown up in Dublin around horses used to pull carts with heavy loads. However, there was unrest on the Mexican-US border around this time with a Mexican revolutionary general called Pancho Villa. On the 9th of March 1916, Pancho Villa led a raid against a small US-Mexican border town called Columbus. 18 Americans and about 80 Villistas were killed. The Mexicans were quickly retreated to escape US retaliation. In response to Villa's raid on Columbus, President Wilson sent 5,000 men of the US Army and the National Guard and authorized US Army General John Pershing to mount an expedition into Mexico to capture Villa and bring him back to justice. The 1st Pennsylvania Field Artillery National Guard were among the troops mobilized, and John Davis set out for Mexico along with his comrades. This is a photo taken of John during his service with the 1st Pennsylvania Field Artillery National Guard. Pershing's force chased Villa until February 1917, but Villa continued to evade his pursuers during the 9-month incursion into Mexican sovereign territory. Little real military action was seen on the Mexican border, so in order to keep the troops focused and to demonstrate the might of the US forces to the Mexicans, extensive training exercises were conducted along the Mexican border. This training later proved to be very important in preparing the troops for the roles they would play in World War I. The mission ended when the United States entered World War I in 1917, and General Pershing was recalled. The men of the National Guard were then absorbed into the American Army, and John joined Battery C of the 107th Field Artillery on the 14th of July 1917. They initially trained in Phoenixville until the 28th of August 1917 and were then moved to Camp Hancock in Augusta, Georgia. General Pershing was concerned that the level of artillery training that the troops had received did not fully equip them for the type of warfare that existed in Europe at that time. In addition, the troops would be using the French 75mm cannon in Europe, which was a more accurate and faster firing artillery piece than the American 3-inch cannon that the troops were used to. General Pershing insisted that an advance group be sent out ahead of the main body of troops to receive training on the new cannon and set up training camps for the American troops. The advance group was called the Advanced School Detachment, and John, as chief mechanic of Battery C, was assigned to this group. They sailed from New York on the 30th of April 1918 aboard the ship Finland, bound for Brest in France. The remainder of the 107th left Augusta on the 11th of May 1918, bound for Camp Mills on Long Island, New York. They remained there until they boarded the troop ship Saturnia on the 18th of May 1918 and sailed for Europe, arriving in Liverpool on the 29th of May 1918. Having travelled from Liverpool to Southampton and Le Havre, the regiment finally arrived in its French training camp at Moucon on the 3rd of June 1918 to begin the training organised by the Advanced School Detachment. John was reunited with his 3-member mechanical crew, and they began training on the new equipment to make themselves ready to do repairs under battlefield conditions. The battery were moved from Moucon to Fiume, arriving on the 12th of August 1918, where they were to put up a defence to stop the German army advancing on Paris. The first battle action of the 107th Field Artillery was at 3 p.m. on the 15th of August 1918, when they fired their first shot against the enemy. The crew were complimented on their accuracy for hitting the target, but the celebrations were short-lived, as the Germans responded with gas shells containing a mix of phosgene and tear gas that made it necessary for the 107th to wear their gas masks for 2 hours. This was the first taste of the type of war that World War I had become, and must have been a shock to the troops. The 107th Field Artillery entered the Uy-en-Ypres offensive on August 18, 1918, and were quickly receiving heavy bombardment from the German artillery. The batteries were well dug in, so their positions were relatively safe. However, during the bombardment, Private Walter Manny was struck in the chest by a flying fragment, and he became the first casualty in Battery C. This must have focused John and his comrades on the fact that this was no longer a training exercise, but real life and death warfare. Up to now the weather had been fine, but after the 25th of August, bad weather set in and conditions became difficult, with heavy and prolonged rain. The regiment was moved by train and by foot across France until they reached the Argonne forest on September the 20th, 1918. The 107th Field Artillery, along with 600,000 other American troops, were moved into the Meuse-Argonne area north of Verdun on the night of the 25th-26th of September 1918, under the cover of darkness. This offensive was to become the biggest battle in American history in terms of casualties and the ground forces involved. At 11 p.m. on September the 25th, the whole Allied front seemed as if hell had turned loose. The sky was lit up with flares of the guns and the rockets. The Allied forces made rapid advances during the drive forward, and on the 30th of September, Battery C came across an abandoned German 77mm artillery piece, along with 3 cartloads of ammunition. Battery C very quickly figured out how to aim and fire the gun, and turned the gun around and fired the German shells at the retreating German troops. The fierce artillery battle continued for several days, and a dugout was being constructed by Battery C for the protection of the men. A large German 88mm shell made a direct hit on the half-completed dugout. 7 members of the battery were killed and 9 were wounded, including James Kelly, one of John Davis's mechanics. This sad affair had a great effect on the battery, as it was the first fatalities, and a very sad feeling reigned over the battery, with thoughts of the fate that might await any of them at any minute. For John Davis, he was now down to 2 mechanics available to maintain equipment, and this obviously put extra strain on the mechanical crew. On the 18th of October 1918, Battery C were moved by train to Ypres. The next morning they hiked across Vimy Ridge, one of the bloodiest battlefields of the war. It was a wasteland, with trees cut off at the roots, hundreds of smashed tanks scattered all around, and was the most desolate place they had ever seen. They took up a firing position ready for action. At daybreak, Lieutenant John Smith and Corporal Williams went out to establish a forward observation post. They were spotted by a German machine gun post, and Lieutenant Smith was shot in the chest. Corporal Williams dragged Lieutenant Smith into a small trench and gave him first aid. After working for 15 minutes on him, Williams thought he was dead. Looking over the rim of the trench, Williams saw 4 Germans approaching him. Fearing for his own life, he crawled on his hands and knees until he reached safety. Unfortunately, a few days previously, the battery had received their pay and had intended to send money home to their families for Christmas. But the money could not be sent at that time, and the Christmas money was entrusted to Lieutenant Smith for safekeeping. Lieutenant Smith had over 18,000 francs, roughly $3,000 of the Christmas money on his person at the time he was shot. They sent out a search party that night to try and recover the body, but despite searching all night, they could not find the body, and the money was never seen again. The boys of Battery C never forgave the Germans for this, and I am sure they delivered their artillery barrages with added gusto at the Germans after that. The engagement continued, with each side exchanging artillery fire, sometimes at very close range. The Germans were in full retreat, but were still putting up a fierce fighting withdrawal. At this stage, men and pack animals were literally falling down with exhaustion, and it was questionable how long they could keep up the pursuit of the German army. At 10:30 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, a vehicle came racing up the road with the news that the armistice was to be put into effect at 11 a.m. that day. The good news was received with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. The war was finally over. The 107th had happy thoughts of returning home, perhaps for Christmas, but alas, this was not to be. Demand for ships to ferry troops home was high, and they had to wait their turn. They remained where they were until the 19th of November, and then started a very long trek across Belgium and France, until they finally reached the port of Saint-Nazaire on the 27th of April 1919. On the 28th of April at 12:45 a.m, they set sail from Saint-Nazaire on board the good ship Mongolia, bound for the USA. When they passed the Statue of Liberty on the morning of May the 9th, their hearts leaped for joy. They docked at Hoboken at 11 a.m. that morning. Shortly afterwards, they took trains for Camp Dix. They stayed at Camp Dix longer than they had expected, as they were required to take part in parades through New York City. The regiment was demobilised on May the 22nd, 1919. They received their final rousing welcome in Phoenixville that evening, and after a large banquet, eagerly departed for the homes and families they had not seen in 2 years. John Davis returned to his job in the Phoenix Iron Company and rejoined civilian life. He married Lottie Patton on the 7th of April 1926 in Phoenixville. Lottie had 3 children from a previous marriage, and John and Lottie went on to have 2 children of their own, Lottie P. Davis in 1927 and John Robert Davis in 1930. They set up their home initially in Buchanan Street, Phoenixville, and later on 2nd Avenue. John Davis passed away on the 25th of February 1963, aged 72 years, leaving us with our Pennsylvania cousins and an incredible story. Well, that's all for now. Thank you for watching another story from the Davis Family History video series. Goodbye for now. Slán leat.